The Jimmy Butler saga has finally come to an end, and with that the Warriors finally got their second creator next to Steph Curry. That Golden State front office was desperate to make something happen, reportedly making a call for pretty much every all-star level player this league has to offer, and I won't lie, they did a pretty good job of maintaining assets. Sure, they had to include Andrew Wiggins and Kyle Anderson to make the contracts work, they sent away a top 10 protected first round pick, and they lost a couple rotation players in Dennis Schroeder and Lindy Waters, but in terms of the valuable pieces of their young core, they didn't completely destroy their future. Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Podziemski, and Moses Moody are still on the roster, and they still have their first round picks in 5 of the next 6 years. The only long-term implication this trade may have is the fact that they had to pay Jimmy Butler, signing him to a 2-year, $112 million extension, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. But for now, I want to focus on the short term and whether or not this move actually moves the needle for the Warriors. As things currently stand, the team is 11th in the West with a record of 25-26. But you can make the argument that a near 500 record actually overstates their level of play. They started the season on fire, winning 10 of their first 12 games and leaving a lot of people wondering if they'd be back to contending. Since then, they've gone 15-24, and it's been the result of a complete offensive collapse. During those most recent 39 games, they've scored an average of about 111 points every 75 possessions, good for 26th in the NBA over the stretch. And the problems are across the board, top to bottom. After a scorching hot first few games, Buddy Hield just simply hasn't been anywhere near as effective scoring the ball. Trayce Jackson-Davis is their go-to athletic finisher off of screens and dump-offs, except he struggles on every shot that isn't a dunk. Draymond seemed to have his three-point shot back, only for that to regress to the mean, rendering him a non-scoring threat, and Kuminga, who they need to be a secondary scorer, has been hurt, then when he's been on the floor still hasn't taken that next leap. GP2 is basically only on the floor to defend. Looney is basically only on the floor to screen, pass, and rebound. Shout out to Podziemski and Moody because I think they've both played well, but they are far from third options on even just a play-in team. With all of these holes in offensive production, the Warriors have basically been Steph or nothing, and that's a ton of reliance to put on a 36-year-old guard. It's pretty clear that he isn't the same one-man offense that he was a few years ago. His conditioning's gotten a lot worse with age, so we're seeing more and more of these performances where he sort of feels like a non-factor. He's gotten a step slower, especially changing directions, so he not only gets into the paint less, but he creates less space on his three-pointers, resulting in the second lowest three-point percentage of his career. In totality, his scoring has just really regressed this season. He's averaging under 23 points a game, making it the lowest mark he's had since 2012, and his true shooting percentage is down below 60% for the first time since 2013. The craziest part though is that because Steph still demands so much defensive attention and applies so much pressure through his movement and long-range shooting, the Warriors have still been a good offensive team during his minutes. If we exclude garbage time, they've had an offensive rating of 117.6 with Steph on the floor. That's good for the 76th percentile among players with at least 500 minutes and ahead of names like Tyrese Halliburton, Kevin Durant, and LeBron James. With him off the floor, however, they've completely collapsed, producing an offensive rating of just 104.5. For reference on how bad that is, it's actually below the Charlotte Hornets when LaMelo Ball isn't on the floor. They desperately needed anyone who could run the bench unit while also relieving some of that pressure off of Steph. They thought Schroeder would be that guy for them, and he just wasn't. So that's when they started making calls for basically every all-star in the league, eventually landing Jimmy Butler, who, in my opinion, has become pretty underrated throughout this entire process. For all of Jimmy's flaws, and I certainly think he's regressed in the past few seasons, he does remain a very reliable shot creator. One area in which the Warriors desperately needed improvement was the ability to get to the rim. Even at age 35, Jimmy's got the handle, the physicality, and most importantly, the first step to apply consistent downhill pressure. On the season, he's averaging just under 6 shots at the rim every 75 possessions and making an impressive 71.8% of them. The only other non-bigs reaching both of those marks are LeBron, Jalen Johnson, and Shea. With the ability to get to and finish at the rim, Jimmy also remains one of the best foul drawers in the league. Say what you want about the ethical side of it and whether or not it's fun to watch, but he knows how to get to the line. This season, he's 6th in the NBA, attempting about 8 free throws every 75 possessions. As a team, the Warriors have only generated about 20 free throws a game, good for 28th in the league. So, right away, a team that had no rim pressure and couldn't get to the line adds a player who excels in both of those areas. And another thing that Jimmy brings to the table is the ability to make passing reads out of those attacks. He won't do anything super advanced, but he's a good kickout passer who consistently creates open threes, and he quite literally never turns the ball over. I actually think taking care of the ball is a skill that often gets overlooked. When the ball is in Jimmy's hands, your team is basically guaranteed to get a shot off, and he can operate in so many different ways, from spread pick and roll to perimeter or face-up isolation to, of course, attacking mismatches in the post. In addition to the on-ball capability, I also really like his fit with the motion offense because of how active and smart he is with his movement. He's a willing and effective screener, so that already opens up the door for so much action. He's a genius cutter who consistently makes himself available for easy layups or quick duck-ins, and he's one of very few wings who can make a legitimate impact on the offensive glass. So going back to what I said about taking care of possessions by not turning it over, he also extends them with second chance opportunities. The only real drawback with Jimmy as an off-ball player is that he isn't much of a three-point shooter at all, which can somewhat limit the spacing, especially if you're putting him in a front court that already has Draymond Green. My initial thought as soon as the trade was announced was that the Warriors now desperately needed a stretch 5 to pull it together. I didn't care if it was Turner, Vooch, Brook Lopez, Kelly Olynyk. In order to make this offense work to its maximum potential, it would take another big body who could space the floor, and I was so certain that they weren't done making moves that I waited a whole extra day to make this video. Then they exited the deadline with Quentin Post as their only stretch big, and shout out to Post, but he is not a starter on a playoff team. For that reason, I still think this is a very flawed offense. Jimmy fills some needs, but the collective scoring outside of him and Steph is really limited, and the only way they can get size on the floor is by completely sacrificing space. Thankfully for them though, throughout the turmoil of this season, they've actually remained a very good defense. Draymond was legitimately playing like a defensive player of the year before he got hurt, and across the board from the scheme to the rotations to the rebounding, the team has looked sharp. That's reflected in the numbers where they still have a defensive rating of 113.3, enough to just crack the top 10. Now you're adding Jimmy to the equation, who, don't get me wrong, does take a lot of plays off at this point, but is still a very good off-ball defender. People have been talking a lot about the collective IQ of pairing up Luka and LeBron, and rightfully so. Well, pairing up Jimmy and Draymond is about as close as you can get to that on the defensive side of the ball. They both see the game so incredibly well, anticipate everything, and those two roaming the floor will undoubtedly terrorize most of the offenses in the league. One thing I'm really looking for with Jimmy though is whether he still has the ability to flip the switch and get aggressive, because probably his biggest superpower as a defender has been the way he just absolutely destroys passing lanes and creates turnovers. But in the past couple of seasons, this hasn't really shown up as much, with both his steal and deflection numbers showing noticeable regression. The other thing that really worries me is that Jimmy might just be cooked as an on-ball defender at this point. He's pretty good against bigger wings because of his strength, but he isn't quick enough to match up with guards, and he certainly isn't fighting through screens. And this is a bit of a problem because of who the Warriors had to deal in the trade. Dennis Schroeder was their go-to guy at the point of attack against guards, and for all of the offensive drawbacks, he played that role very well. Andrew Wiggins was their go-to guy against wings and forwards, and he too played that role very well. Now the roster has basically been gutted of point of attack defense, and the only way for them to get some of that back is to give GP2 more minutes, which then brings me back to the spacing problems. So, in all honesty, I actually think you could argue the Warriors got worse as a defense despite what Jimmy brings to the table. When you pair that with the still very flawed offense, I really don't view this move as much of a needle mover at all. They definitely improved offensively, and that alone should make them a more dangerous playoff team, but in terms of seriously competing for a championship or even a conference finals appearance, I don't see it. They desperately need a stretch 5, and they desperately need some point of attack defenders who can produce offensively. Which takes me back to the long-term implications of this deal, because now you're in a position where you need to retool in the offseason and build that roster. The problem is, with Jimmy and Steph both making over $50 million and Draymond making $24 million, their options are pretty limited. Both GP2 and Looney expire this year, so that's $17 million off the books, but they'll also have to pay Jonathan Kuminga, who will be a restricted free agent, so they might not come into any space, or even worse, could be forced to let him walk. Either way, I do think there's something to explore with the core of Steph, Jimmy, and Draymond. It's fun, it's got a really nice blend of two-way play, and now it's up to the front office to put together the rest of the team. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on to be first on more content. If you're interested in my more in-depth research, make sure to check out the Hoop Venue podcast and my social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you think of the Warriors. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.